Yo, have you ever listened to Nirvana? They've had an unshakable impact on the music industry for longer than I've been alive. Now, this impact can be put down to the relatable nature of their music, but I would say the majority of it comes down to the tragic story of Kurt Cobain. I've recently seen a lot of conversations asking about why Kurt Cobain gets so many mentions in rap and in hip-hop, which basically boils down to a question about his influence over hip-hop as a whole. And while thinking of my response, it added a layer of complexity to the question. So the simple answer is yes. Kurt Cobain did influence hip-hop. The more important question that you should consider is, did hip-hop learn anything from Kurt Cobain? Absolutely not. And that's what I want to have a conversation with you about. Now, obviously I'm going to be establishing Kurt Cobain's general influence and go over the impact Kurt had, or rather should have had, on rap. But at a certain point, this video is going to become a bit of a Juice WRLD video near the end, but it'll all tie back in. I'm just letting you know now so you don't feel like I was selling you a false product. Just think of it as a 2-for-1 special, alright? Don't say I never give you nothing. It's obvious that Kurt Cobain as a figure was much bigger than just a rock star. The subject matter in Nirvana's music of frustration, confusion, hurt, anger just came across as distinct to listeners, and is part of the reason they still have a large amount of fans to this day. Now, Kurt himself often appeared as a down-to-earth character that just happened to blow up into a massive artist, and this characterization made him recognizable, relatable, and inspirational to people across many different demographics. And as older generations constantly like to remind people, rock and roll was the biggest and most played genre of music at the time, at least more so than hip-hop. And that fact amplified the spread of Kurt's punk rock influence. But what is Kurt Cobain's specific influence over hip-hop, I hear you asking? Well, start looking at the comparison between the concepts being displayed in these different music genres. If you look past the cultural and circumstantial differences between hip-hop and Nirvana's music, you can pick out the similarities. In fact, Kurt Cobain himself is quoted as saying, "Rap music is the only vital form of music introduced since punk rock." But to flesh out these concepts a little bit more, what are the reasons you fell in love with hip-hop? My own personal reason is that hip-hop can often evoke really deep emotions and make you feel really introspective about yourself. The representations of overcoming of a struggle or expressions of pain as a sort of therapy is something that helped me become more connected to hip-hop in a way that I've never experienced with any other kind of music. It's real and authentic, and while it can be uplifting, it is often really reflective and relatable. And Nirvana as a band are often described in a very similar way, and thus a lot of their music blended in with people, like myself, that primarily enjoy hip-hop. Thus, Nirvana and Kurt Cobain as a figure pops up in hip-hop pretty frequently. And as we often unfortunately see, when people die, they become almost like godlike figures. To give examples of their influence and the inspiration taken from other artists, we can see it reflected in Jay-Z's Holy Grail, where he mentions Kurt by name. Kid Cudi has also done multiple interviews where he mentions that he took direct inspiration from Nirvana and the life of Kurt Cobain, mentioning that without their music, that he doesn't think he would be in the position that he's in today. But I think the best characterization of Kurt that you'll see is represented by Denzel Curry's Clout Cobain. The song is a perfect representation about the amount of fake care and love that both people in the industry and fans tend to showcase towards artists. They only really care about you when you aren't making them money, or aren't making them music anymore, aka when you're dead. And this is where this video and this subject gets a lot more complicated and a lot more serious. When I say, did hip-hop learn from Kurt Cobain, I mean, did they learn from the tragedy of his death to start to treat artists better? Kurt Cobain was the biggest thing in rock and roll, and he got there because he, along with Nirvana, made music about having struggles. You can't make that type of music if you don't actually have issues you're dealing with. And while Kurt's situation was often publicized both in his music and in the media, there seemed to be a lack of recognition or concern for the severity of his problems. You can only imagine how isolating that must feel when you're standing on stage, singing songs about how things are making you fall apart, and nobody actually can take a second to recognize that you're actually still falling apart right in front of them. It's been reported that Kurt had ongoing issues with drug addiction and mental illness, and from a fan point of view, there's nothing you can really do about that. But I think his management, or the music label executives who are managing the spread of his music, needed to take more accountability and responsibility for his well-being outside of just making music that was making them money. I think it's pretty damning that he was only 27 years old and he blew up from nothing to something and just couldn't handle it. And it just seems like no one who knew the inner workings of his situation was really there trying to help him out. So you'd think after a tragic loss of a talented artist at such a young age that there would be more preventative and protective measures in place for artists, right? Unfortunately not. So let's talk about the tragic loss of Juice WRLD now. Hip-hop had obviously overtaken rock and roll and became the biggest genre in the world. And lucid dreams had propelled Juice WRLD into being one of the best upcoming stars on the planet. Much of Juice WRLD's music, especially his earlier projects, would mention how he would abuse substances to help him cope with the struggles he was facing. Fast forward onto December 9th, 2018, and Juice WRLD passes away from an alleged drug overdose at 21 years old. Now for me, Juice WRLD's death hit really hard. Not because I was a diehard fan or anything, but because he was only a bit older than I was. He had literally everything that anyone my age would want. Money, fame, talent, etc. So for him to be gone so instantly, like for someone that was on a complete another level to me, having passed away, made things feel really pointless. And the more I hear about his passing, the more frustrated I feel about it. Now, I'm older than Juice was when he passed, and I still feel like an idiot kid. So looking back at the fact he was 21 and no one was there trying to dig him out of a serious drug problem that he had gotten himself into before his passing seems confusing. And when I heard Wishing Well off of Legends Never Die, it really set me off. To me, that song came across as a massive cry for help. And it was a song that was mixed, mastered, and probably listened to by a bunch of his people, including his managers and label execs, plus friends and family, and nobody really said anything to him or pulled him aside and tried to get him help for an issue he was clearly having. And the cherry on top of all of this is that they have the balls to release Wishing Well after his death so that they can continue to profit off of the drug abuse that caused his untimely death. Ridiculous. Juice also has a song called Legends, dedicated to the passing of both X and Lil Peep. In the song, he references the 27 Club, which, if you didn't know, refers to a long list of musicians that passed away when they were only 27 years old. A list that includes Kurt Cobain. But as Juice mentions in the song, we ain't making it past 21. A thing you gotta remember is that all these rising stars are simply just kids. And now all of a sudden, when people should be learning from the tragic passings of previous artists and making improvements over the protection for them, we are having them die at even younger ages. It shouldn't be a concern for an artist to try and survive their 20s. They should be able to take time to make their music and figure shit out, like any normal 20-year-old. The more experienced adults that use them to make profit just simply aren't providing them with enough protection, and that needs to change. Too often we see that label executives are trying to treat music like any other kind of business. The problem is the product they're trying to sell is not some inanimate object. Music is created from a person's being, their emotions and experiences. They themselves are the product, which often leads to them not being treated as a person. If you look at Pop Smoke, Lil Peep, X, and Juice, if they had better people looking out for them, I wouldn't be making this point in this video at all. It might sound a little harsh, but it's just the reality of the situation. They were all young adults who needed guidance, and that's why they hired managers and signed for labels in the first place. Artists, as much as they are products, are people with lives and families, and they're too often treated like any other commodity. We've lost so much talent, and what changed? It feels like absolutely nothing. So did Kurt Cobain change hip-hop? Unfortunately, no. It appears that history is just set to repeat itself, and that's just tragic. So what can you do to change things? First of all, stop saying stupid shit. If you say an artist fell off because they stopped doing drugs, you're an idiot. And hopefully with time, the more fans recognize these issues within the industry, the labels that profit off of these artists will stop solely benefiting off of someone's trauma, and will find ways to help prevent it in the future, so that we can stop hearing about the tragic deaths of so many talented young artists like Kurt Cobain and Juice WRLD.